We've already covered the Gewehr 1888 commission rifle. Here, we'll reintroduce the action, now as a carbine. Hi, I'm Othais, and this, there we go, down here. This is the German Karabiner 1888, a beautiful little thing that we need to get over to the light box. Weighing in at just 6.8 pounds and with an overall length of 37.5 inch, this is handy. Now, we still have 5 rounds of 7.92 by 57mm feeding from an end block. We've done a lot of history on the basis for this gun already in two previous episodes. Now, that is a lot to take in, so you don't have to watch them, but I think it would help a bit. For those of you who choose not to, though, let's just do a quick recap. Germany had adopted a black powder repeating rifle in a bid to maintain superior firepower over their arch rivals, the dreaded French. They cranked up production to rapidly replace their existing single-shot rifles. Unfortunately, the French had other ideas and unleashed the Lebel 1886 with its smokeless powdered 8mm cartridge. So Germany had to hit the brakes hard, and in just about 1 year flat, they would develop an entirely new and smokeless rifle to compete. This short window, however, meant that they would have to select from ideas that were already proven in the field. So they would take that previous Mauser 7184 action and, turning it over to one Louis Schlegelmilch, add front-locking lugs for strength. Stealing from their neighbors, they would rework Ferdinand Mannlicher's 1886 N-block clip magazine, modifying it slightly, but not enough to avoid trouble down the line. And finally, they would control barrel expansion and prevent soldiers from playing hot potato with the introduction of Armand Meig's barrel jacket. And if you want any more detail than that, you have to go back. Now, there is one thing I want to mention about those previous episodes, because there's one detail that I actually managed to skirt over just wrong. So, let's cover it right now, just to set the record straight. So, in that episode, I mentioned that when you have an S mark over your chamber, then you have been rechambered for the new Spitzer cartridge. That is still true, but I happen to refer to that modification as being an 88/S. Well, not technically, because when they first did the conversion, they did not remark the rear sights. So they were just regular Gewehr 88s that happened to have a new chamber. They didn't make a distinction in the model name. Later, during the war in 1915, they would go ahead and say, look, we're starting to have to issue actual S-Patron ammunition with these guns, so we're going to need to remark the sights because it's too confusing for soldiers to convert how the sight should be on the fly. Those guns were reamed and remarked. Those guns are the 88S. Sorry for that little error. And while we're making corrections, let me go ahead and do one other, which is that at the time we filmed the 88 episode, we had a reproduction 88 clip. Now we have an original. We made sure to get one for the rest of these episodes. And so, before we wade too deep into this, I'm sure none of you will mind a little extra May as she goes ahead and gives this one another shot with the original hardware. That never gets old. Alright, so I feel a lot better about having properly addressed this rifle. So let's set it down for a moment, and let's get into our new carbine. Now, you might have wondered why we did not cover this back then. Well, answer one, we didn't have the two forms of this gun that we needed to show you. And answer two is that this gun also kicks into a family of other rifles that are so closely related that if it were any other combination of ownerships, we would all be calling them the same name. That is going to be our next two episodes, making this episode technically 3 of 5, which is how influential the 88 really is. So, Germany has progressed from the single-shot 71, 71-84, and then to the 88 in smokeless powder. Where is the cavalry, though? Because they are still set all the way back on that 71 black powder single shot. And as a matter of fact, a significant number of them are still armed with converted French single-shot rifles. It's time, finally, for them to be caught up to something more modern. Interestingly, those 71 carbines were so slow into getting into the hands they should be that they were actually finally issued fully just a few weeks before the 1888 was adopted. Now, along with the cavalry, a number of other specialty troops found this carbine more useful than a rifle, just like with any other army. Now, in defense of the lack of an adoption of a 71-84 carbine, several factors go into this. One, there was still an old guard mentality in a lot of places that the weapons of the cavalry should be the saber and the lance, and those are the two things that strike fear into enemy troops, more so than especially trying to aim a rifle from horseback. That's really not all that realistic anyway. But, funny thing is, accurate repeating rifles and available ammunition make pretty short work of men sat way up high on horses. I mean, previously with single-shot rifles, you know, you're advancing pretty fast, the troops have to take the time to reload, there's a lot of opportunities to unseat you. But with a repeater, yeah, you missed the first, you missed the second, well, you got a couple of times to get this guy before he's finally on top of you, if you have any view of him whatsoever before the approach. And it's not like they were jumping horses out of trees. So, there isn't a strong push for a good cavalry carbine until there's strong resistance by the average infantryman to cavalry. Make sense? Anyway, they did, in fact, consider a 71-84 carbine anyway. These things made it to trials, and arguably they didn't make a whole lot of sense because being a tube magazine, the shortened length meant a lower capacity. And again, the French sort of wiped out the whole point in 1887. It wasn't all for naught though, because several features like the simple side sling hole and the type of rear sight were carried over into our gun today. In December of 1888, Prussia would contract with 2 manufacturers in the Seoul region to produce this gun. Sort of. You see, in true German fashion, they had not actually decided exactly what they wanted. They just had a general overview. Now, when they signed these contracts, they went for 200,000 of these things at 47 marks apiece, and Württemberg and Saxony joined on in for a nice big group buy. Bavaria had decided that they could produce their own at home, like with the 88s, and save a buck. They also decided that Prussia was being a bunch of pushy jerks. Anyway, this is a German thing at the time where they want to rearm as fast as possible. They really want to get these into the hands of soldiers, and so they're pushing specifically to try to get these carbines out at the same time as the 88 rifles. Just start issuing it all in one batch, avoid the confusion, and keep a strong, united frontline army. So, as they are tooling up for the contract, and they have to put the machines in the hands of the manufacturers and things like that, they go ahead and work out the details of the gun while getting ready to assemble guns. So, trials of certain features are ongoing while everything's tooling up, which honestly is extremely efficient, although it can mean that there's a lot of room for some pushback deadlines as problems crop up. But anyway, here's what they knew that they wanted at the start of this. It should be roughly 950 millimeters long. It should have a semi-pistol grip stock. The barrel jacket should be slightly conical, slimming at the front to keep it lean. There should be a front barrel band and nose piece like that last gat they tried out. The rear sight should use a smaller ladder with several stepped tangent range settings. This would replace the extra battle sight leaf from the infantry rifle, which they believed would snag in the cavalry sheath. There would be a recoil bolt through the stock. This may be where the rifle got its own recoil bolt, or vice versa, we're not sure. That nose cap would not have wings that came up to protect the front sight. There would be a flat-handled, spoon-shaped bolt to avoid snagging and poking when worn on the back. And the sling would be fitted with a simple hole in the stock and a loop at the barrel band. So no sling swivels flopping around here. They would also share the same bottlenose 7.92 smokeless powder cartridge as the long rifle, making them a bit, well, barky. Of course, you'll get to see that feature in a moment. Now, obviously, what I have here is not the same as everything on that list, so let's take a closer look. Alright, overall, we're still dealing with the Gewehr 88 in the sense that we have our, let me get my patented plastic pokey hand, we have our split breech receiver, which means that our bolt handle passes through the back of the receiver and turns down there mid-action. It's also interesting to note with these 88s that the root of the bolt handle does not act as an emergency lug. It's actually locked at the front, and that's where the locking happens. Alright, so this particular guy still has all the updates that we talked about before, like that left side gas shield, and all the same functionality with the safety back here, our bolt release here, we load from an end block clip into the top, and then if we need to release it early, we can use this button. On this particular one, it would still fall out the bottom because it's in original configuration, and we still have a jacketed barrel to help with heat and barrel expansion. But let's talk about our differences with that earlier list of things, because they certainly did not adopt everything. For one thing, we have a straight wrist stock. We do not have the semi-pistol grip. This was likely done in order to be able to share stock blanks and other things with the rifles. It would have been a huge pain to work up a whole different pattern just for a small batch of carbines by the comparative large number of rifles. So we do have our spoon handle bolt that they recommended. This is actually amazing for keeping it out of your way, although I find that there's not a lot of room to get your hand up under there. It's quite compact. It's a little bit of checkering to kind of help though. All right, on the rear sight, they did not go with their new concept of having the tangent settings because they found that when you tried to put this in and out of a sheath with on a horse, really this thing would flip up and get caught and bent if you allowed it to sit taller by accident. So if you accidentally set it for the further setting and flopped it down, I mean, you can see there's a lot of opportunity for that to happen. So they went for a nice positive lock. You can see that it fits down below the tabs. And then they went ahead and put back that sort of initial battle sight and then flip up extended battle sight. And then we have our graduated ladder for longer ranges like we're used to. All right, so walking down, they did actually taper the barrel jacket, which turned out to be a very costly and difficult process at first until someone came along and improved it by using a roller system to kind of just tighten it down at the front rather quickly. So some money got saved down the line, although at first this was pretty tricky. At the front, the sight is actually protected. And it's especially protected because it's keeping it from bumping those dovetails in there from once it gets set. So I guess they went away from that idea of just sort of walking it all the way down and leaving this completely exposed. Now, the downside to this, like we talked about with the Enfields, is that it doesn't always let light in, which is I imagine what they were trying to avoid. But realistically, this is a much better system to keep this thing from getting dinged and danged, especially if you're going to be pulling it in and out of the sheath all the time. Notice, by the way, this is really well rounded up here, so that there's not any chance of snagging, and it's rounded in such a way that it can be drawn back without snagging as well. Now, this final configuration did not come about until April of 1889, and even then it wasn't completely approved by Spandau until July of that same year. So this is starting to drag behind the rifles by a considerable bit. So they finally managed to push it over to those two manufacturers, who I should probably actually name. C&Rsenal and V.C. Schilling, both known for their commercial arms, both fairly small by comparison to this contract. Some parts of the gun would be made by both firms. Some were made exclusively by one or the other. Like, the receivers were supposedly all made by Hanel, and then marked by whoever assembled. For certain small parts, like the ejector and extractor, neither would produce them, instead having them shipped in from elsewhere. Now, the equipment, tooling, and gauges necessary to complete these rifles, because not all of that was handy for those two firms, well, it needed to come from the government, specifically through Spandau, and only after the government facilities were set up with their equipment. So, realistically, Haenel and Schilling would not be able to give a schedule for the production, let alone produce, until April of 1890. They would project 17,000 carbines as early as July 1890, with additional deliveries in 20 and 40,000 unit batches until October of 1892. Now, of course, none of us would imagine that taking two technically smaller firms compared to the contract and giving them a gun that was in development as it was being assigned and delaying the delivery of their tooling and equipment and requiring them to share and interchange parts and somehow keep the serials straight and who's marking what all together. None of that would lead to a situation in which we went off schedule almost immediately. None at all. And the government inspectors were particularly unhappy with both of them in a number of ways. However, they really especially did not like the leadership at Haenel, finding them lazy and detached. But let's just go over some of the complaints that were affiliated with both firms. Lack of running water at the factories meant that workers had to leave to fetch fresh drinks or utility water, which meant that the gates were left open all day for loiterers to gather. They believe there is poor supervision over the work teams and a lack of clear assigned roles for individuals or teams as a whole. They found the equipment to be poor of quality and poorly maintained, and overall they complained of filthy workspaces. Specifically, the assembly shops were named for being particularly terrible because they would have things like people finishing stocks, and I mean like sanding and scraping stocks in the same room as somebody assembling parts. So you have sawdust and oftentimes spoiled grease being worked together before being assembled into the gun, which means grit and dirt. And on top of that, apparently, according to the record, the workers did not always have the best hygiene, and they would take their dirty hands and rub them up and down the action. By the way, I've gotten quite a few notes from you guys wanting me to wear gloves. I assure you, we oil these after every shoot. And I mostly keep my workplace clean. Now, unfortunately, I can't find any record of disciplinary action or changes, but it appears that something held together because these guns still got done, and we don't see them all rusting to pieces, so they must have improved somewhere along the line. It couldn't be all bad because it seems at some levels inspection was carried out by both the Prussians and the factory's own people. Both Haenel and Schilling had their own inspection marks, which can often be found alongside royal inspectors. It seems rifles can be a complete potluck of who inspected what, as you can find any combination of these three in various places. The first batch of 21,000 or so carbines were ready in August of 1890, so that was a miss. Production couldn't sustain 200 finished carbines a day, so none of those other dates would be met either if we do the math. I'm sorry to say I did not find the date for when that last batch finally came through. I can guarantee, however, it was late. So I've listed two manufacturers, and some of you who actually have one of these are looking at it going, that's not what mine says. Well, of course there has to be a third, right? Because we said that Bavaria was going to go on their own. Except they didn't. As a matter of fact, Bavaria ran the numbers finally to figure out whether or not, but what it would cost to produce this in any sort of reasonable time along the same schedule as their rifle, and they realized that they would need new tooling and new workers and blah, 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 and that would add a 20% premium per gun. So they were not going to be doing it by themselves. Instead, they would turn around and head back to Prussia with an estimate of, I believe, 22,000 that they would need, and Prussia would roll it out from the current production, which means that now Prussia is short, and on top of that, there's some other models that need to get handed out that they didn't see, and anyway, Prussia turns to the Erfurt arsenal and says, hey, you guys are passing peak production soon, so when we get through July of 1891, let's go ahead and turn you over to a batch of 25,000 of these little guys. Just a one-time run. Which wouldn't entirely be true because we know that they're going to go on to produce some more of our next gun today. And it would also put Erfurt on an interesting position because it seems like they become short rifle or carbine experts for quite a few years to come, as we've seen in other episodes. With all that wrapped up, I think we've reached a stopping point good enough to bring in an animation by our friend Bruno and see how this gun works. And this, for the first time, by the way, is going to be a chance for you to have seen both my original 2D animations and now his 3D on the same action. We'll load up 5 cartridges in our handy end-block clip, which stays fixed in the magazine as we shoot. The follower passes between the lips of the clip and pushes up those cartridges while the clip stays locked in place. The safety is the classic Mauser flag, turned to lock the cocking piece to the rear, preventing discharge. We can also see the problem with the bolt head. Notice how the cartridge does not feed under the extractor. Instead, it lips over the cartridge as it closes. The clip is constantly held up by the next cartridge in line, which is held up by the follower. As the last cartridge feeds, there's nothing to hold the clip up and it falls free of the action. Alright, let's let Mae take a turn at this little darling. You know, after that performance, I think we know how well this will do at the end of the episode, at least to a degree. Although we've been throwing some curveballs in this show before. Carcanos and Enfields. So, let's talk about the history again. These guns were so delayed that it took months to get them into their roles behind the rifles, and ultimately you wouldn't see them in their final home down to the level of the Landwehr Cavalry until the beginning of 1893. Interestingly, along with that process, right at the beginning, one particular group of people would go ahead and get some of the first of these guns, and you'd be surprised to find out that it was actually the rural police. That is, the Prussian Land Gendarmerie, which I'm sure someone will get on me about pronouncing correctly. I already said what it was, guys. So, why would they end up with something so advanced so early? Well, that would be by order of the Kaiser himself. You see, over in the Ruhr Basin, a number of miners were kind of irritated, and honestly, for fair reason. I don't think they were being treated very well at all. And there's a whole history there that you guys can check out, but we're going to have to walk around the edges of it because it's really not our forte. But these guys started protesting, taking off from work, strikes, that sort of thing, and it got a little heated. Now, the rural police, anyway, those guys, they were armed with like clubs and single-shot pistols, and some had been outfitted with revolvers, but this is a large group of shovel and pick-wielding men of burly stature. That makes them intimidating, and there's a lot of them. So, the local authorities, by virtue of some sort of loopholes in the imperial system at that time, which I am not that privy to, actually had a direct line to the Kaiser in terms of their reporting. And so, they would write a letter of their concern, and having read it, and recently being shown this gun, because he approved everything, well, he just put 2 and 2 together and said, hey, can we get some of those for the other guys? And when the Kaiser says, can we get some of those for the other guys, you ultimately end up with 4,400 of these prime military rifles in the hands of your, well, honestly, enforcement police in 1890. I don't think the miners were too happy about it, given that this rearmament came on the heels of the mine operators and government officials failing to keep their negotiated promises that had halted the strikes in the first place. Now, while we're covering Car 88 oddities, some of you might earlier have gotten confused when I listed 3 manufacturers and you ended up with a 4th or 5th or whatever. Here's the thing. You might have stumbled into something rare if your gun is pitch perfect but doesn't say Erfurt, Schilling, or Haenel, because Saxony would later find out that they were 800 short, mostly for the bakers, which is... Guys, I just go off the notes here, but that sounds delicious. Now, in order to get their 800, they would just go ahead and convert from long rifles. So any number of markings can be found on those particular small batch of guns. All right, now, to get moving in a slightly different direction, we are going to need to turn the clock back down to 1890 and talk about what this gun cannot do, which is replace a previous popular rifle. You see, this is the Mauser Jägerbuchse, a shortened form of the 1871 that was popular for basically anybody who didn't need a long rifle. Now, originally it had been created for the elite Jaeger battalion, but because of its shorter length, you know, foot artillery, pioneers, naval and colonial troops, it's great. Just like with the cavalry, these guys would need their own shortened 88 action, and we've already got this one, so it'll probably do, but we better make sure. And so they trial the action in January of 1890. And it was especially focused on light artillery and foot artillery, and the ultimate decision was that the light artillery specifically was just fine with the Reichsrevolver. Those poor bastards. The foot artillery, however, were doing just fine with this carbine. It was a perfect fit, except for one problem. They did not have horses, not to themselves, and that meant that they didn't have sheaths, so there was nowhere to put this. I mean, you could leave it on your back with the thing, but, you know, you got other work to do. You don't need your rifle stuck to you everywhere you go when you're artillery. They needed a way to stick these off to the side, and as we know, the preferred method is to have a stacking swivel or stacking hook, and so they'd have to take this design and do an amazing amount of dramatic changes in order to get this, the incredibly different and not at all identical except for that one little piece right there, Gewehr 1891. Let's put it in the picture thing. With an overall length of 37.5 inch, incredibly different from the previous, and with a weight of just about 7 pounds, again, radically far away from that little carbine, this gun, very different, 5 rounds from the end block 7.92x57. You can see there's a lot going on here. Now, I want to be clear that this is a Gewehr, which means rifle, okay? This is a Karabiner, carbine. They are obviously very different, all right? It's not as if they're identical length, stock configuration, rear sight, front sight protector. It's definitely not all exactly the same. You know, let me tell you, the difference between a carbine and a rifle, if anybody asks you, is a little piece of bent metal right here. That's it. All right, so these guys became the German equivalent of the Carcano TS, which means that they were issued to everybody that didn't need a long rifle and didn't ride on a horsey. Although a lot of people that didn't ride on horses also got this guy in the same effect as this one. I guess presumably they had places to put their guns that they didn't need them to stack up. But anyway, this gun you see in the hands of things like bicyclists and airshipmen, which is a cool new job. And also whoever else that needs to be able to stack up their gun and don't have a place to put it. All right, so these guys were going to be produced by the same 3 firms. And unfortunately, I was unable to turn up specific numbers for these guns, so I'm not sure how they rolled into the original production, or if they caused extended production, or if Erfurt had to double up. Although it does seem that Erfurt versions of these are a little bit more common. So take that as you will. I'm sorry to say, if anybody has the data, by all means send it over. But they existed and they're neat and they're kind of hard to find, and we managed to get one here today. So thank you for loaning it to us, because this comes from another viewer. All right, so while we have the gun, I want to make sure with this and that together that we do a solid comparison so that you can see the difference. So let me just And, how am I gonna, okay, let me just, okay, he can go there. That's the Car 88. Hey, there we go. I got some room sort of now. Okay. Car 88, Gewehr 91. There's the hook. And with that covered, let's go ahead and get it over to Mae for a demonstration. You see, on the range, that's where the differences really come out. But confusingly, by the time of the Great War, these guns were effectively, whether they be a Car 88 or Gewehr 91, effectively being treated roughly the same because they were all sort of surplus inventory after they were usurped by the Car 98 AZ, though the 88s did get converted up to the Spitzer cartridge, and the carbines were no different. This lighter, faster, and overall more powerful cartridge wasn't too much for their locking action, but it dang near might have been for that short barrel. Muzzle blast was severe. Just like with the rifles, the updated carbines, or Gewehr 91s, were marked with an S over the chamber. Both of these have it as well. I will say, however, for anyone who would like to shoot one of these, do have a little caution, because just because it can chamber the new Spitzer cartridge, it won't necessarily blow up. They do have a different bore diameter because they were never re-barreled, and they were not re-sighted for the new cartridge either. You may have noticed the impacts were a little high on that target. So, these guns by 1910 are all the way down to the reserves or into storage. They are really not in active service. And then by 1914, I'd say almost half are being surplused or discharged or sold off. It's looking like a long, slow decline for the Car 88 and Gewehr 91, despite how obviously beautiful they are. And it seems that they would basically be a peacetime gun if it weren't for the fact that war were declared. As always, this rapidly expanding conflict of attrition meant that everything that could fire standard service ammo was dragged out, and then everything that could fire anything was dragged out. So, like we've covered before, the entire 88 family is going to go back into the field, with the pure 88s and 8805s especially getting into the Landwehr, and sometimes into the front lines. But the Car 88 and the Gewehr 91 are a little bit unique, because A, they are in very short supply after the war. They have not gone through the 05 stripper clip conversion process. These still use end blocks and are expected to really only shoot the 88 cartridge. These are walking out. But guess what? We also have a kind of more highly mobile war. I mean, we have things like, airships now, and these guns are uniquely lighter and smaller than even the current Karabiner 98 AZ. The Gewehr 91 specifically would stay with the artillery, or rather be reissued to artillery all over again, because, as we covered in our Luger episodes, there was a shortage of what was supposed to displace both this and the Car 98 AZ for the artillerymen. So all the way to the end of the war, as a matter of fact, because they could never quite catch up production on those things, because they kept getting stolen by assault troops, these things would still be soldiering. frankly fantastic. As a matter of fact, the reserves on both this gun and the Kar 88 would fall completely to zero as they were redistributed into roles where they were useful, and in a lot of cases, troops that needed a carbine were going to be issued full Gewehr 88s because that's what was available. So what was left in inventory definitely got used. And if you want to see, look, they're small. There's not a lot of these things around, so it's not like you're tripping over them. But if you want to see the respect they had, let's just look at what the Germans did with the other guns. So the other old 88s were pushed out of service as fast as possible, and then even given away to the Austrians and to the Ottomans, but not these. Oh no. We're keeping these close to the chest. And if you think about it, okay, hold on guys. This is always so hard to do in here. If you think about it, it's not the worst decision to go ahead and keep especially these around, because you're realistically giving them to people whose primary job is not to be fighting with them. I doubt that there were many people harmed by these guns during the war. These were definitely rear echelon or other specialty troop guns. But if your job is to have this with you but not really use it all that often, and it turns out that in addition to that, it actually does run quite well. I mean, we saw Mae with it. You're not hurting anything to have 5 rounds of standard service ammunition in a reliable package, in a compact package that you don't have to fret over, and you don't have to expend the extra material to make a new gun to put in that guy's hands. These things are wonderful in the Great War. It's wonderful that they're available. However, by the end of the war, they are actually dated technology. And as we've covered before, Germany would be under restrictions post-war and have to limit the number of arms that they had. And in that case, they chose their best guns to go ahead and re-inventory, and the rest were disposed of. And so that makes these guys a World War carbine. Anyway, let's go ahead though, and despite these sort of background roll of this gun, give it a full opinion from Mae, and see how she feels about both of these very unique and completely different from each other designs. Once more, we've made room for Mae, and no guns just yet, because before we get to our main topic today, just like at the beginning of this episode, we have to sort of readdress the original Gewehr 88. And it deserves that because we had used a reproduction clip, it was all we had at the time, and we have now found an original. And so we took both of these out to the range. Here, I'll let you have that.
Thank you.
And I'll let you have this.
Appreciate it.
And now we need Mae's opinion corrected for having the original military issue clip. So how do you feel now about the Gewehr 88? Not a lot of detail, but just sort of catch us up. Is there any real difference between the reproduction clip and the original?
Using the reproduction clip, the bolt was very sticky, the rounds weren't feeding properly. It was a mess, to say the least. Using the original clip, when we first started on the range, was a mess. It was completely awful. We had to spend about 20 minutes, and I would say about 24 rounds of ammunition trying to get this perfect, because it just, over 100 years, it gotten bent out of shape, and it just either wouldn't seat properly, wouldn't feed the next round properly, wouldn't eject properly. It was just giving us so much grief. And finally, Othais got it bent just to the right spot. One full clip in, loaded all the rounds perfectly. One more full clip, did the next rounds properly. Put them in the next 2 guns, all of them fed properly. It ran like a top when it was in the perfect shape. And that does concern me a little, because it had to be in the perfect shape to run, even well. Like, that's actually a very startling thing.
Yeah, Mae?
Sure.
I will say, coming from military supply, these would all have been preformed by a machine, essentially, and set in with their cartridges properly, we assume. And then the cartridges would help it hold its shape. One of these things sitting around without cartridges in it is very likely to get dinged up or smushed. So they probably were fine. I'd say 99 out of 100 or more were fine in combat. Which means what you saw on video in terms of the gun running just perfectly, no misfeeds or anything like that, okay. But it does give you pause that there's one component that comes in little packages that have to be carried on your back or your hip or whatever. And they can get smashed or dinged, and you have to feed them into the gun. And just that one component is enough to sort of halt the action. Now, of course, every gun is like that. I mean, if the feed lips internally get messed up, the argument on the other side is that because the feed lips are removable, if you have a bad set, you just pop them out, you put in another set, the gun doesn't have damaged feed lips and just stop working. So there's two sides to that. But again, this is sort of the Achilles heel of the 88 system in pretty much all of these Monlinker systems. So it's just something to keep in mind, because for once we saw a clear demonstration of that. You can go back to that episode and see it feed poorly, and you can go back to this episode and see it feed well. It's the exact same gun. It's the exact same, loaded up ammo, and no, it's just complete difference based on just this clip. All right, so now that we have the 88 in hand, let's talk about the carbine forms. So we'll start with the earlier Car 88. So let me get this into your hands.
Thank you.
And we'll get back on track like we usually do and do the ergonomics.
First things first, of course, being a carbine, it's smaller, it's lighter, it's got better balance to it. This is actually really comfortable and tight. It's fairly thin, so I did really appreciate just the size of this guy. Now, I will say I don't appreciate the, of course, straight wrist here on the gun. I honestly prefer semi-pistol grips. I wish they would have decided to go with that. It's just easier to get a better purchase on her. However, with this one, it's still not terrible. I mean, at least the comb is high enough that I'm able to get like a nice good cheek weld on there that easily sets me to line up with the sights. So, yeah, I'll take the good with the bad on this one. It's all right. It's definitely manageable. Now next, the barrel jacket. As I mentioned before, on the long rifle, I wasn't really a big fan of it. Yes, it does keep the gun cooler. However, I just found that it would ding up pretty easily because being that long, it just stuck out that far. However, on the carbine, it's shorter. There's just less surface area for me to go whacking it around on something. So I like the barrel jacket on this guy because it does what it needs to do, which is keep the rifle cooler and also doesn't jut out as far, so less likely for me to bang it up. And last but not least, I do want to talk about handling the bolt on this guy. Oh my God, was it smooth. It was amazing. It was fantastic. I thought it was like a dream come true. I got through the first few rounds, the next clip, and then finally I noticed after about, I would say it was like a dozen rounds, I started to feel a little bit of a bruise developing on the palm of my hand. And I'm going to go ahead and say this right here and right now. There are exactly now 3 guns that we have shot so far for the series that have given me or left me a bruise. Gewehr, the brief little snip we did of the wall gun, and this guy, because it's the spoon handle bolt. It's kind of like, it's like a butter knife. It's not really sharp enough to cut you, but like if you hit it hard enough, it's still going to leave a little bit, of an imprint there. That's really what it was about. Just the action itself is incredibly smooth, but just after a certain number of rounds, eventually, it really it left an impact on my hand, and I wasn't a big fan of that. So smooth, but came with its own price. Oh, and before I forget, the safety. Standard flag safety. No real big surprise there, easy to operate. But ergonomics-wise, smaller, leaner, not quite meaner, but definitely functional. I just wish they'd, fatten this up a little bit right here on the bolt handle.
For my opinion, the Car 88, may I borrow that back?
No.
The Car 88, when you first pick it up, you're in love. It's small, it's handy, it's light, it points, it has a nice wide open trigger guard, everything about it's where you want it to be. It's not quite depositing you by the trigger like later guns would, but it's still, it feels good. And honestly, a lot of people consider this to be one of the best stalking rifles ever made for hunting and things like that. And in that regard, they're not wrong, because when you're doing that, you're not pumping out 20 rounds at a time. I agree with Mae. As you start to use the gun, a couple things become apparent. You really want to pull in on this, and you've got nothing. There's no help. And then, I didn't even notice the spoon bolt at first either. Like, I'm just like, yeah, okay, fine, spoon bolt. And then after a while, you start going, why does my palm hurt? And it's just that razor's edge digging in every time you cock down. And you've got to pick up ammo, and don't get me wrong, it's plenty smooth. And believe me, we were talking about the fact that you have to have the clip just right or these things get kind of snaggy. Well, I hope your clip's right before you use that, especially because a reproduction clip with as stiff as it was on that was, I can't even imagine. It makes me sore thinking of it. So there's some real downsides to this gun, even though operationally, functionally, it was a thing of beauty. But let's go ahead and get into actually firing it. How did it go once the gun went bang?
Let's start out with the loading. Loading on these guys was fast, smooth, didn't really have any problems there once the clip was, of course, in the right shape. So once that was perfect, loading was a breeze. Sights, you know what, honestly, they're just tall enough. I think they are just in the right range as far as sights go. And I was thought for sure that these front sight wings would actually get in the way, that they would block more of my vision, but once you line them up behind the rear sight, they just barely stick up over it, so they were okay. Honestly, these sights were pretty dang decent in my opinion. The trigger is a wonderful two-stage trigger, very smooth, clean break, no problems there. And last but not least, the recoil. Now, I will say, I'll start out by saying I am a recoil queen, so I do actually enjoy a lot of recoil. And when you're on the range, you're having fun, you're just carrying on with friends or whatever, it's more recoil is just fun. It's a hoot. You know, the big muzzle blast, the loud concussive force or sound, it's all fun. But when you're in battle, having to make a bunch of follow-up shots, it really isn't fun. It's distracting. It takes more time to realign your sights. It's not helpful, honestly. So I can actually understand why they decided to extend the Kar98AZ, not make it quite as short. I can totally understand that.
Yeah, they did make, as we covered in our 98AZ, a 98 carbine this long. And it was painful to use, I'm sure. We are not covering that because they were in such insignificant numbers for the war that they really don't break into our series. But just to give you an understanding of where we were at when we shot this on the range, we could not figure out whether we were going to shoot a Spitzer cartridge from it or the original bottlenose or what the heck to do because the context is World War I. So we kind of split the difference. We used the 318 bottlenose like you saw, but we went ahead and unlike the previous episode with the 88 when we gave it the nice soft 88 load data, we just dialed about 10% off of the regular S-Patron load data. So that means it was shooting nice and hot, but out of a bottlenose cartridge that was better fit to this bore, even though this can in an emergency shoot, you know, S-Patronen. Well, not even an emergency. It's set up to shoot S-Patronen, but I wouldn't want to do it all day and burn up the barrel. So we cut it both ways. So that's why you see such, honestly, forcible recoil coming out of this little thing. It's running a little hotter than its original ammo. Not quite as bad as the S-Patronen. So that's going to put us right where we want to be to show it for World War I. And, of course, the natural conclusion is I see why they did the Kar98Z the way they did. This is definitely distracting for anybody standing next to you if you're one of many people in a line. I kind of am almost tempted to take it to an indoor range and see if I can burst any light bulbs. But, rudeness on the range aside, we should probably get back around to talking about the fact that this is one of two guns that we're supposed to talk about today. So while Mae has the Kar88, excuse me, I've been saying Kar98 too much. She has the Kar88. I have an entirely different weapon. This is the Gewehr 91. So that's a carbine. This is obviously a short rifle. Since they are so different, I'm going to trade you.
Okay.
Thank you. And then all I need you to do is, starting from scratch, we need to go through the ergonomics.
Okay, sure. Differences between the carbine and the short rifle. Right here. It's got a stacking hook. That's it. Seriously, Othais, these are the same gun.
I will have you know that these are inherently different and that there is a very important reason why they are different and why they cannot even be possibly linked to the same genus. And I have prepared footage to prove it.
Are we really doing this?
Alright, fine. They're the same gun. Alright, they're the exact same fucking gun. I don't know why one is considered a carbine versus a rifle, other than just the doctrine of, well, we're adopting a rifle and we're adopting a carbine, and it's just the name carrying over. We see this 1,000 times in the world of military collectible rifles. Someone says, this is what we're looking for, and you name it according to what they're looking for, not what you ultimately get. They put a wire on the Car 88. I give up. But you gotta admit, it's a handy wire. So, I guess if we're considering them the same gun, I can set this aside and we can just talk about the one. Both of these considered a singular unit. The Gewehr, oh, there's already Gewehr 88. I guess we have to call it the Karabiner 91 if they're like the Brangelina thing. So, I know I'm old. So, does this actually work for you in the context of a trench in World War I? Has it survived those ages and functioned well enough for you to stake your life on it?
Didn't you just call this one the carbine and that one the short rifle? Whatever. Anyway, so I really want these guys to be in my top 5 just because when they were working perfectly, they were working perfectly. Ran like tops. After just a few rounds, it was still easily manageable, beautiful. But I do have some concerns that actually bump them out of my top 10. A big concern is actually double feeding on this one. So the bolt head doesn't really catch the round. So like if I have an issue where I need to pull the round out before I bolt it all the way home, I actually can't. I either have to bolt all the way home, or if I can't do that, I have to manually rip the round out myself, which that's a huge concern in my book. It should be able to lip over the round. So that's one that I think definitely needs to be addressed. If not now, maybe in one of its cousins. Now, another concern, they actually did fix it on this one. This one does have the World War I update where it has a little clip on the bottom. So instead of the clip popping out the bottom of the mag, I'm able to just ping it out the top with a fun little button, like a Garand. And last but not least, the recoil. I really feel like that was a big enough concern that it definitely does need to be addressed, because for repeat fire, it's just going to become too much of a problem in my book. It's just not going to be something that's going to be manageable with time. So these performed well enough that yes, I would take them into battle. I'm just incredibly lukewarm about it. They just barely get a yes in my book.
All right. I'd probably go with a more solid yes, but I agree with May. The double feeding doesn't seem like a major thing, and as we've covered before, the Germans had a solution for that they did not implement because of the cost and time. And they probably should have, because, yes, you can train around it, but then in the heat of battle, you just don't want one mistake becoming 2 mistakes if there's a mechanical solution for that. It feels a little sloppy. And it's going to be addressed, as we'll see on later models. Now, the other problem, like she said, on this guy you can actually see we have the open bottom Mannlicher port that lets in mud, is what we're alluding to there. That problem was solved by the Germans. They actually did just pop a clip on there with a little coil spring, and then boom, kick it out the top. We've talked about that before too. So, it really comes down to, do you want to let the spoon bolt beat you up? And do you want to deal with that repeated muzzle blast and recoil? And for me, I can deal with it. I can deal with it just fine. It's not any worse than some of the other stuff like a Berthier carbine or something like that, although the Berthier doesn't beat up your hand as much. However, I do agree that this is a gun that could have been in the top 5, top 10, and it's just walked out because of these small issues. That being said, development time of 1 year. 1 year. I mean, not for specifically the carbine. There's an tack on another 4 months, and you get the carbine. And that 4 months was smacking this bolt handle down and tapering that off and getting the right shape. So, I don't know. It's very impressive for when it happened and how fast it happened. However, it could be a better gun by the time of World War I. But these are reserve arms, so beggars choosers. Now, with all that wrapped up, I need to go ahead and say a special thanks to Michael. And then I need to tell you guys that we are going to have an episode with Mark on that Gewehr 91 right there. You would not believe the shape it was in when it got here. And we fired it. So, with that, we'll wrap out. Check after the credits for updates. And thank you all for watching.
Bye, guys.
Alright, updates. Well, for starters, I am swamped. I'm desperately trying to pull ahead of production while integrating a new show, and we've worked out a formula for getting in new arms since it's getting to be a real challenge to get into some of these rares, and the show is continuing to get a lot harder and a lot more expensive to produce, and unfortunately Patreon seems to have topped out at about 35, 36. And so, unless we hit some growth opportunities, this is going to get really challenging. We also haven't really gained a huge number of subscribers in a while either, which means we're probably sitting right where our market is. Unless we've missed out on a few people in pockets that we just haven't figured out how to reach. So if you know someone who would like to see the show, or a venue that would like to feature the show in some way, by all means, share us or email us how we could better work with someone else. Other than that, everything's fine, no need to panic. I'm just going to go put out some fires.